Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to a conversation for a report by Sensafili in collaboration with RCR Wireless News on Backhaul and fronthaul. Today, I'm talking to Tormod Larsen, the CTO at ExteNet, and this is a conversation that we have with a service provider that is enabling the transition to small cells, DAS, and basically helping the densification effort. So in this conversation, we're going to talk about what happens to backhaul as the network densifies, as we move away from mobile networks where macro cells dominate. So Tormod, thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
So to get started, can you tell us what is that you do at ExteNet? It's a new type of effort in the mobile space.
Yeah. Again, my name is Tormod Larsen. I'm a Chief Technology Officer for ExteNet Systems. ExteNet Systems is the largest independent provider of what we call distributed networks. And you mentioned it. It's DAS, small cells, CRAN, Wi-Fi, and we're also looking at different type of technologies where we start distributing more of the functionality to the edge of the network. In a lot of context, people look upon us as a neutral host because our networks we are basically a carrier's carrier. We provide our services to mobile operators normally. We also see that evolving to potentially also building owners and so forth. But we're an infrastructure player. We own and operate the infrastructure and then provide service to other companies. We've been in business since 2002, so you said it's kind of a new thing, but we've done this for quite some time, but obviously it's had evolved from being more of a coverage solution to becoming more and more capacity, and as we're going into 5G, we also see that being part of a necessity from providing the functionality that 5G networks intend to provide. So obviously densification has been a big part of what we have been doing and we see moving forward as well. So
yeah. So and let's just start thinking about the backhaul / fronthaul. How is that different? Because you typically have other DAS or small cells. How is that different from a macro network? Let's just sort of start from the high level here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the first is obviously just the number of locations you try to connect. And because of that, you also have, what we do just from a high level, kind of put the backhaul and fronthaul in context. We provide both the location where you will place the small cell, other than a utility pole, street lamp, traffic light, those type of infrastructure outside or within the building, different places within a building. And then we provide the connectivity, either that being backhaul, fronthaul, back to a aggregation point typically. So where it's different from a macro environment, we deal with a number of different technologies. We mentioned it could be DAS, where we basically are replacing the coaxial cable going up the tower, but we're doing that over fiber. So that's obviously different. So it's a fronthaul way of doing things. We're doing CRAN, where you're basically doing the same thing, but now it's the base station itself that's split in two between the baseband unit in a hub and the nodes that are located on a street lamp, utility pole, and so forth. And most of those are typically very high bandwidth requirements in the gigabits. So, and they also have very sensitivity to the latency. So typically their purpose-built dark fiber is the way to do that. We also do small cells that could be, using backhaul, but unlike with, towers, where you have multiple carriers located on the same tower, in a lot of these environments, despite that, we are on a traffic light or a street lamp or a utility pole, not all of the carriers might be on the same pole because we have access to so many different poles in a particular geographical area, we might put various carriers on that different poles. So we're looking more about the network rather than the sites. For us, it could be one carrier that want to be on a particular intersection because that's where they have their capacity need. Another one might need it mid-block or in a slightly different location. We have that flexibility because we don't purpose build the sites. We're going on existing infrastructure there. So those are just some of the differences. Specifically, fronthaul is different than backhaul, and even with backhaul, just the different kind of architecture of where our customers have their small cells make it a little bit different. And then obviously, we're in environments that you typically not have built backhaul networks in the past on a, dense metropolitan area on a street lamp or locations like that. So that's some of the differences.
Absolutely. So let's start with the small cell. With a small cell where there is not a CRAN, so there is the self-contained a small cell. What kind of solutions are you looking at in terms of backhaul? What works better? Because you have a highly dense network. And then you have indoor versus outdoors too. What are the solutions that work the best there?
Yeah, so I'll start out there and then go indoor, and we do both. I didn't mention that earlier. So we do networks both indoor and outdoor. And we actually started outdoor and then eventually added indoor to our portfolio. But, we built a lot of dark fiber. And the reason that dark fiber being such a critical element of what we do is because we are a neutral host and we are working with multiple carriers, the aggregate amount of bandwidth that we'll require, even a small cell environment, is pretty high. We also like the flexibility that provide us both technically and from a business perspective. Traditional lit service model becoming challenging for the carriers from a cost perspective. And it's also not as flexible, in terms of potentially having one customer doing small cells, another one doing CRAN, and so forth. So that's been kind of our primary way of doing it. We're also looking at a number of wireless solutions, and typically in conjunction with fiber. So when we typically build a fiber network, we have a backbone and then we have laterals to connect in the small cell locations. We seeing that portion of it in some cases, those laterals being using wireless, either being millimeter wave. There's some free space optic solutions out there, some microwave solutions. I think we've tested about 20 of them. Some of them works okay, and a lot of them actually doesn't work as well in the environment we're in. And particularly some of the challenges we have is sway on the poles. So you're not having the alignment that is required if you have a very narrow aperture on the wireless solution. Just adding additional equipment to the poles that already have a lot of them could be a challenge. And in some instances, even the cost haven't come down to a point where when we look at the total cost of ownership relative to fiber, might not pan out. On the other hand, there could be quick to deploy versus fiber that typically takes a while. So we even done that where we start out with a wireless solution as a temporary solution to get to the fiber downstream.
What about wireless solutions that sort of point to multi-point, lower frequencies? Are those, because you seem to imply more like line of sight, high frequency backhaul, wireless backhaul?
Yeah, so we looked at some of those as well. And one of them that we actually did quite a bit with is like a UE or LTE relay, where you actually utilizing the LTE network to backhaul for kind of in band if you want.
Yeah.
And we saw a lot of promise in that, specifically in more of the suburban market where maybe the capacity needs are not as great. but it's obviously required that the carrier have enough spectrum and is comfortable with it. But the benefit is point to multi-point, so you could do quite a few things with that and have kind of a more of an architecture play. You're setting up aggregation sites. It could be a macro site, or it could be specific distributed node sites that act as master, so to speak, and then mesh off from there if you want. We looked at a few others as well, but typically the bandwidth provided by those lower frequency solutions is not high enough to be able to provide, again, from a neutral host multi-carrier perspective, enough capacity. So that's been, a little bit of where we're at right now. And again, in the end of the day, we have all of those tools in our tool bag, and it depends on the particular network we're building and the customers and what we try to accomplish. But we obviously look very much into the future, try to look into the future, because our business is all about being able to get multiple carriers or multiple customers on those networks in the long term.
Right, and I'm going to get to that in a second, but let me first ask you, as we move to a cloud-run architecture, even for small cells, how, are you ready for this? And it seems like since you're working, you prefer fiber, it might not be much of an issue to move from backhaul to fronthaul, or is there something here that you need to take care of, that it's going to be different?
It's some differences, but from a physical layer perspective, we have a very good base with the fiber, to your point. And, you talk about cloud, and, it's a lot of infrastructure that's needed to build a very robust cloud. So that's where it starts. And then how you configure it or connect it together, becoming more of a back end side of it. So that's the other reason we also like, fiber, because it gives us a lot of that flexibility. And even, our investor, which is one of them is Digital Bridge, they look at what they call communication infrastructure. And if you look at that and where that is evolving, that's how we look at, we don't want to be locked into a particular way of leveraging the infrastructure, or if you talk about fronthaul, backhaul, cloud type, we know that infrastructure could support that evolution. And that's where kind of the little bit of the trick is for us, is to balancing that, for the long run versus how it's used in the short term. Yes, and
in that respect, moving back to the sort of the neutral host, the need that you have to support multiple operators, how do you find in that? Because in some cases they will have to maybe not share the radio, but you want them to share the backhaul. What is their reaction, or how do you see that developing?
No, so that's another reason that fiber has some advantages. Because when we build fiber, yes, it's one a cable, but it consists of a number of strands of fiber. So if we have customers that want to feel that comfortable with that physical layer, that they know they have a strand that's dedicated to them and they could basically do with it whatever they want, that provide, again, that flexibility for us to provide that type of common infrastructure, one investment, but still provide a dedicated level of service. So, that is typically how things have been done. And if you look at the macro environment, more and more of the macro backhaul is done on direct fiber as well. So that's what we see even more being a natural part of small cells, and even more so with CRAN, where it has to be dark fiber based on some of the performance features that are in LTE Advanced, and certainly will be part of 5G. Some of those comp type features that require it to be a very defined delay through the fiber. They need to know how much that is. Mm-hmm. So if you then use lit service or internet, you don't have that guarantee for latency, and then those features doesn't work. So, that's another part of it. So typically, you say it's shared, but we have the ability to provide a dedicated, service that they are comfortable with. Traditionally, backhaul, you multiplex onto a common medium as well, which is very common or has been very common in the backhaul for macro sites. We don't see that as much, but it's obviously an opportunity as well. If you do microwave or millimeter wave and you don't want to put up, separate radios for each of the carriers, you could do that as well. And as far as you could provide an SLA to the carriers, they are comfortable with that because it's been done in the past.
So you don't feel that the operators feel like they're losing control because they still control the RAN, so they feel comfortable sharing the backhaul?
Yes, and remember, each of the carriers will always have a SLA, service level agreement, based on how much bandwidth they will have on that type of a backhaul. But more and more, because it's dark fiber, it's not only, then it's not a bandwidth, it's basically a medium that connecting from A to B or A to a number of sites, and they could run 50 megabits over it, or they could run gigabits over it, they could run CPRI, they could run DAS over it. So that's been more the model that had been the case in the past. So far with distributed networks, as densification continued to grow, you could discuss if that's an efficient way of doing it, but that's at least what we're seeing for the time being.
Yeah. So how much does that help the business case? Because if you look at the business case for small cells, it's still a little bit difficult right now, because oftentimes you have to find a solution. So we're not there. You don't have the same model as the macro model. We're still learning. So it's a little bit more intensive in terms of cost, especially when operators do it themselves. So how important do you think that the ability to share the backhaul is in terms of improving the business case?
Well, I think it's critical. It might sound self-serving bit of what we're doing, but if you look at, to your point, now you have so many more sites. So it's, I think, both a cost element to it, and it's a practical element to it as well. Could you really get, parallel fiber networks or backhaul networks, in a lot of these dense metropolitan areas? It's, ducts and what you could kind of really get to these various poles could be a challenge. So I think it's critical, and to your point, I think it's even more there that we'll see as we get into even denser networks in terms of what elements are shared versus which ones are dedicated. And we even see that now the carriers are not deploying as many frequency bands as they did in the past to, again, try to reduce the cost. So I think it's just something we'll continue to see. It's almost like we saw in the ILEC world when it comes to fixed infrastructure or fixed networks, where it made sense to have common network elements, and then the differentiation was more on the service that was provided than the actual physical infrastructure.
So when it comes to the backhaul / fronthaul, as long as you have a good SLA, operator is happy, or do they need something else in the way they manage in terms of having visibility in the network? Because oftentimes they're starting now to, manage the networks in real time. So do you need to give them some additional help, provide some transparency so that they can see what's going on?
Yeah, I think transparency has been from the early start of our business a key success criteria for us, because we don't have a retail business. We're all wholesale, and we want to obviously enable our customers to be as successful as they can be, and part of that is being transparent. So that's been part of our goal and objectives all along. So I think that that continued to be even more important, to your point about being real time and all that. So it's just increasing the importance of that, and we have the tools and processes in place to support it. Now it's just it need to happen faster. It need to be it's more volume, so you just kind of refine that. And it's not only going for the backhaul, it's going for everything we do, on the sites and the RAN equipment as well as in some cases the carriers completely monitor, but there's certain elements of the maintenance that we do, so need to be a transparency from them to us as well in some instances. So it's an integrated part of how we work together with our customers.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the initial deployment, there's always you hear a lot of challenges out there, because we're doing something fundamental, especially in outdoor, indoor, not the DAS where we understand it much better. But in order to be able to have access to, say, lampposts or other infrastructure, both indoor and outdoor, it's still a little bit difficult because you need to negotiate with cities, and cities don't have much of a track record. How is that? Is that improving? What do you see the major challenges there in terms of the deploying and the backhaul is obviously part of it, because it might or might not be available where you want to put the small cell.
Yeah, no, I would say that it's obviously the part of the challenge is consistency or lack of consistency, and part of that is you're going from one municipality to another. They might not have the regulations and so forth, and it could be neighboring municipalities. So we try to build a network throughout an area. We might touch a number of municipalities, and they have different processes and different ways of handling this and different understanding of what it is all about. So I think that's a process that are ongoing. FCC actually realized that, and they're are working through states and others to improve the education of what this means and why it's important. So that continue being a challenge, but we'll work through that with a lot of different municipalities throughout the nation. And we are also a CLEC in, I think some of it is in 35 and 40 states. And we have a number of agreements with large cities like in New York or San Francisco or major cities that allow us to go on their city-owned infrastructure. So, again, it's a process, and to your point, it's just sometimes when it's new, it takes a little bit longer. But we see it's improving, but it's just now the volume's increasing. So are you able to catch up to the volumes and be able to kind of be a little bit ahead of the tsunami there in terms of getting the municipalities to work a little bit faster, because they might have a process, but it was set up to do a much smaller volume, and now when number of applications are increasing, now how are they able to keep up?
Yeah, and now, as you say, we start seeing more of a scale. The scale is kind of emerging. So if I were to ask you, what is that you're going to see your role and what you do change over the next, say, 5 years?
No, I think that it will change, and part of it is because the use of the wireless networks will also change, right? We've typically been people that have been interacting with the devices, and then obviously that's been kind of what's been driving the need throughout the networks with the introduction of Internet of Things and a lot of other machines and so forth and sensors that are using the network. You need more smarter networks, not only smart devices, you need smarter networks. And we believe that a lot of that smartness or intelligence need to sit closer to the edge of the network, which is kind of the area that we've been providing services in. So we see that we need to add some of that into our networks and part of the service we provide. We also see specifically in the indoor market that our customers traditionally being the wireless carriers. We see the property owners and enterprises becoming also customers because they have specific needs, and they could also leverage the infrastructure, and they need companies like ourselves that know how to build and operate networks. So, all of those are things that are coming together. And, the good news is with our neutral host mentality, we're set up to deal with multiple customers, leveraging the infrastructure. And hopefully that could also help to build, both denser networks, but also expand the areas where these type of networks will be built. And, that's back to kind of the municipality side of it. We see that a lot of times when we talk to CIO of cities, where we could explain to them that, let's work together, because they have certain objectives, either to cover underserved areas or needs that they have. And when they understand that there's an infrastructure going in that create that type of value to the municipalities, now is a different discussion about how do we build these and how do we get through the red tape in a different manner than in the past. So, a lot of that is what I think, we'll focus on, and where we could bring some additional value to the deployment and operation of these networks.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds very interesting, and it looks like we're on a good path to, really real densification, not just trials and real scale. So, Tormod, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks a lot. And this conversation was part of a report on Backhaul, Fronthaul by Sensafili and RCR Wireless that you can download. Thanks to you all for listening in.